The gunshot echoed through the canyon just as Emma Hartley's wagon wheels splintered against the rock, sending her careening off the trail toward the ravine below. And in that suspended moment between life and death, she knew her desperate flight from Kansas City had finally caught up with her. She hit the ground hard, tumbling through sagebrush and dirt until her body slammed against an outcropping of stone that knocked the breath from her lungs. Pain radiated through her ribs, and dust filled her mouth as she gasped for air. Above her, she could hear the thunder of hooves growing closer, the shouts of the men who had been tracking her for 3 days across the New Mexico territory. It was August of 1882, and Emma had thought she could outrun her past, but she had been terribly wrong. She went over the edge. A voice called out, rough and familiar. Wade Garrett, her stepfather's hired gun. Go down and check. Dead or alive, the boss wants proof. Emma pressed herself against the rock, ignoring the sharp sting in her side where blood was beginning to seep through her dress. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, cascading around her shoulders in wild tangles. She was 22 years old, and she had spent the last 3 years working as a seamstress in her stepfather's house, saving every penny she could steal, planning her escape from the marriage he had arranged to a cattle baron twice her age. When she had finally run, she had taken something that belonged to her by right, her mother's inheritance papers that her stepfather had hidden away, documents that proved she owned the land he had been selling off piece by piece. The sound of boots sliding on gravel made her freeze. Someone was coming down the slope. Emma's hand closed around a rock, her only weapon, and she held her breath as the footsteps grew closer. But then another sound cut through the air, the sharp crack of a rifle shot, and the footsteps stopped abruptly. You boys looking for someone. A different voice now, deep and steady, with an authority that made Emma's heart skip. This ain't your business, stranger, Wade shouted back. We're tracking a thief. Thief ran off that way about 10 minutes ago, the stranger said. Saw someone on a paint horse heading east toward the mesas. You might catch them if you hurry. There was a long pause, filled with suspicious muttering, but eventually Emma heard the horses turning, moving away. She waited, counting her heartbeats, until the canyon fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the juniper trees. Then the stranger's voice came again, closer now, gentler. They're gone. You can come out. Emma pressed harder against the rock. How do I know you are not with them? If I was with them, you would be trussed up on a horse right now. A shadow fell across her hiding spot, and she looked up to see a man silhouetted against the bright blue sky. You are hurt. Let me help. He crouched down, and Emma could finally see his face. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. Dark hair curled slightly beneath his worn hat, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, dusty denim and a faded blue shirt, with a leather vest that had seen better years. But it was his expression that made Emma's grip on the rock loosen, concern mixed with a carefulness that suggested he knew what it meant to be afraid. My name is James Kincaid, he said. I work cattle through these parts. I have a camp about a mile north with water and supplies. Those men will figure out my lie soon enough, so we should move. Emma tried to stand and immediately gasped as pain lanced through her side. James moved without asking permission, his arm sliding around her waist to support her weight. The touch was firm but careful, as though she were something fragile he was afraid of breaking. I can walk, she managed, but her legs were trembling. I know you can, he said, but you do not have to. He lifted her with surprising ease, cradling her against his chest as he began to climb back up the slope. Emma wanted to protest, to maintain some shred of dignity, but the truth was she felt as though she might shatter into pieces at any moment. 3 days of running, barely sleeping, eating only what little bread and dried meat she had managed to pack, it had all caught up with her at once. What is your name? James asked as he walked, his breathing steady despite the incline and her added weight. Emma, she whispered. Emma Hartley. Well, Emma Hartley, you have made some dangerous enemies. I took what was mine, she said, her voice stronger now despite the pain. My stepfather stole my inheritance, and I took the papers that prove it. He wants me dead or married off before I can file them with a judge. James was quiet for a moment, navigating around a cluster of rocks. Where were you heading? Santa Fe. I have a cousin there, someone I thought might help me find a lawyer. Santa Fe is 4 days' ride from here if you know the trails, longer if you are trying not to be followed. He glanced down at her. And your wagon just became kindling. Emma closed her eyes against the tears that threatened. She had been so close, and now everything was falling apart again. But then James's arms tightened slightly around her, a gesture of reassurance, and she felt something unexpected, a flicker of hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. His camp was simple but well-maintained. A canvas tent pitched beneath a towering cottonwood tree, with a fire ring surrounded by smooth stones and his horse, a magnificent buckskin gelding, grazing nearby. James set Emma down carefully on a bedroll he had spread in the shade, then moved to build up the fire and set a pot of water to boil. "Let me see where you are hurt," he said, returning with clean cloth and a canteen. Emma hesitated, then slowly unbuttoned the side of her dress enough to reveal the gash along her ribs. It was not as deep as she had feared, but it was bleeding steadily, and the edges were already beginning to bruise. James knelt beside her, and she noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he wet the cloth. "I am not going to hurt you," he said softly, meeting her eyes, "but this needs to be cleaned." "I trust you," Emma said, surprising herself with the truth of it. He worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning the wound and binding it with strips of cloth. His touch was so careful, so different from any man's hands she had known, that Emma found herself studying his face, the concentration in his expression, the way his brow furrowed when she flinched. "You have done this before," she observed. "Worked cattle for 10 years. You learned to patch up injuries, animal and human both." He tied off the bandage and sat back. "That should hold, but you need rest. Those men will search for a while before they give up. What if they come here?" "Then I will tell them the same thing I told them before, that I saw someone riding east." James stood and moved to the fire, ladling beans from a pot into a tin plate. "You need to eat." Emma accepted the food gratefully, realizing she was famished. They ate in companionable silence as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold. She watched James from beneath her lashes, noting the way he moved with an easy confidence, the way he checked the perimeter of the camp periodically, always alert. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally. "You do not know me. For all you know, I am exactly what those men said I am, a thief." James poured coffee into 2 cups and handed her one. "I know what desperate looks like, and I know what evil looks like. You were the former, they were the latter." He settled onto the ground across from her, his back against a rock. "Besides, I never liked the way some men treat women as property to be bought and sold. You sound like you have personal experience with that." A shadow crossed his face. "My mother was married off at 16 to a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. She died when I was 12, worn down by years of trying to be what he demanded. I swore then I would never stand by and watch another woman be treated that way." Emma felt her throat tighten. "I am sorry. It was a long time ago." James looked up at the darkening sky. "You should sleep, I will keep watch." But Emma found she could not sleep, not yet. There was something about this stranger, this cowboy who had saved her life without question, that made her want to talk, to share the burden she had been carrying alone for so long. "My mother died when I was 19, she said quietly. "My father had passed 2 years before that, and she had remarried a man named Charles Dorsey. We thought he was respectable, kind even. But as soon as she was gone, he showed his true nature. He took control of everything she had left me, said a woman could not handle business matters. Then he arranged a marriage for me to Simon Blackwell, a rancher up in Kansas who needed a young wife and was willing to pay handsomely for one. But you ran." "Not at first. I tried to be obedient, to accept what I thought was my fate, but then I overheard Charles and Simon talking. They were planning to have me declared mentally unfit after the wedding, to lock me away so they could split my inheritance between them. My mother's land, her money, everything she had worked so hard to build, it would all disappear. Emma's hands clenched around the coffee cup. So I searched Charles's study until I found the papers, and I left in the middle of the night. I thought if I could just get far enough away, if I could file those documents with a judge, I would be free. "You will be," James said with such conviction that Emma almost believed him. "We will get you to Santa Fe. You cannot make that journey alone, not with men hunting you, and I know these territories better than most. The cattle drive does not start for another 2 weeks, so I have time." He met her gaze across the fire. "If you will accept my help." Emma felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Why would you do this for me?" James was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Because everyone deserves a chance to be free. And because there is something in your eyes that reminds me of wild horses I have seen, beautiful and strong, but waiting for the moment they can run." No one had ever spoken to her that way before, with such understanding, such respect. Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a wall she had built around her heart beginning to crack. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their lives. James told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the way the prairie looked during a thunderstorm when lightning illuminated the entire sky. Emma told him about her mother's garden, about the dresses she had sewn with careful stitches, about the books she had read in secret because Charles had forbidden her from wasting time on such frivolous pursuits. When Emma finally did sleep, wrapped in James's spare blanket with the fire crackling nearby, she slept more deeply than she had in years. And when she woke in the gray light of dawn to find James sitting watch, his rifle across his knees and his eyes scanning the horizon, she felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt safe. They set out at first light, Emma riding double behind James on his buckskin. The horse, whose name was Copper, accepted the extra weight without complaint, responding to James's gentle guidance with the trust of a longtime companion. Emma had no choice but to hold onto James's waist as they rode, and she found herself acutely aware of the solid warmth of him, the way his body moved with the horse's rhythm, the steady beating of his heart against her cheek when the trail grew steep and she had to press closer. James took them along paths that seemed invisible to Emma's eyes, winding through canyons and across mesas, always staying off the main roads where Wade Garrett and his men might be searching. They stopped frequently to rest Copper and to let Emma stretch her injured side, and during those stops, James would scout ahead on foot, making sure their route was clear. On the second day of travel, they came across an abandoned homestead, the cabin half collapsed but with a well that still held clean water. While Copper drank his fill, James explored the ruins and emerged with a weathered saddle and a few tins of preserved food that had been left behind. "Whoever lived here left in a hurry," he said, examining the saddle. "But this is still good. We can rig it for you so you can ride properly instead of holding on for dear life." Emma watched as he worked, his hands moving with practiced skill as he adjusted straps and tested buckles. "You are very resourceful. You learn to make do out here. The land does not forgive waste or foolishness." He glanced at her with a slight smile, "but it rewards those who pay attention." With the saddle secured behind his, Emma could sit more comfortably, her hands resting on James's shoulders instead of clinging to his waist. But she found she missed the closeness, the intimacy of holding on to him. The realization startled her. She barely knew this man, yet she felt more connected to him than she had to anyone in her entire life. That night, they camped in a grove of aspens, the leaves whispering overhead like 1,000 secrets. James caught 2 rabbits with snares he had set, and they roasted them over the fire, the smell making Emma's mouth water. As they ate, a coyote howled in the distance and Emma shivered despite the warmth of the flames. "Are you cold?" James asked immediately, already reaching for his coat. "No, I am fine. Just the sound, it makes me think of how wild this land is, how unforgiving." "It can be both those things," James agreed, "but it can also be beautiful, free. There are no rules out here except the ones nature sets, no one to tell you who you should be or what you should want." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "That is why I love it. That is why I could never go back to living in a town with all their expectations and judgments. Do you ever get lonely?" James looked at her, and in his eyes, Emma saw a vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "Sometimes, but I have always thought loneliness was better than being with someone who makes you feel alone." Emma understood exactly what he meant. She had felt alone every day in Charles's house, surrounded by people but never truly seen, never truly known. But here with James in the middle of this vast wilderness, she felt less alone than she ever had. "You are trembling," James said suddenly, his voice low with concern. Emma had not realized it, but it was true. Her whole body was shaking, though not from cold or fear. It was something else, something deeper, a lifetime of holding herself together finally beginning to unravel. James moved closer, his hand hovering near her shoulder as though asking permission. "May I?" he asked quietly. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. James's arm came around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. The touch was gentle, respectful, and yet it unlocked something in Emma that she had kept tightly bound for years. She turned her face into his shoulder, and the tears came at last. Tears for her mother, for the life she had lost, for the fear that had been her constant companion. James did not speak. He simply held her, one hand rubbing slow circles on her back, the other cradling her head. When Emma finally pulled back, embarrassed by her outburst, she found him watching her with such tenderness that her breath caught. "I am sorry," she whispered. "For what? For being human?" James shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for, Emma. It is just that no one has ever held me like I am something precious instead of something to be managed or controlled." She looked down at her hands. "Because no one ever held me this gently." James's fingers touched her chin, tilting her face up until their eyes met. "Then everyone before me was a fool." The moment stretched between them, charged with something electric. Emma could see the question in James's eyes, the same question that was pounding through her own heart. Then slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, James leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question more than a demand. Emma's eyes fluttered closed as she answered it, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart racing as fast as her own. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that since the moment I saw you," he admitted quietly. "But I did not want to presume to make you feel that my help came with conditions." "It did not feel like conditions," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It felt like coming home." They kissed again, deeper this time, Emma's fingers threading through James's hair while his arms tightened around her. The fire crackled beside them, and overhead, the stars blazed in the clear night sky, bearing witness to the beginning of something neither of them had expected but both desperately needed. When they finally settled down to sleep, Emma lay curled against James's side, his arm around her and his breathing slowly evening out as he drifted off. She stared up at the aspen leaves dancing in the moonlight and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt happy. The next morning they woke to find their camp surrounded by a group of riders. Emma's heart seized with terror, certain that Wade Garrett had found them, but James placed a calming hand on her arm as he stood. "Morning, Kincaid," one of the riders called out. He was an older man with silver hair and a weathered face. "Heard you were still out this way." "Marshal Henderson," James replied with evident relief. "You are a long way from Socorro. Got word there was some trouble brewing." Cattle baron named Blackwell hired some guns to track down a runaway fiancé, figured you might have run across them. The marshal's sharp eyes moved to Emma. This her? James stepped protectively in front of Emma. This is Emma Hartley, and she is no criminal. Her stepfather and Blackwell are trying to steal her inheritance. Emma stood, her legs shaky but her voice firm. I have documents that prove my mother's land belongs to me, Marshal. My stepfather, Charles Dorsey, has been selling it illegally and planned to have me committed after the wedding so he could take everything. Marshal Henderson dismounted and approached slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. Miss Hartley, I am going to need to see those papers. Emma's hand went to the leather satchel she had been guarding with her life. She had sewn it into her skirts after she fled, too paranoid to let it out of her possession even for a moment. With trembling fingers, she opened it and withdrew the bundle of documents, her mother's will, the land deeds, letters from lawyers, all the proof she needed. The marshal examined them carefully while his men waited in silence. James stood close to Emma, not touching her but ready to act if needed. Finally, Marshal Henderson looked up, his expression grave. These look legitimate to me, and if what you say is true, then Dorsey and Blackwell have committed multiple crimes. Fraud, conspiracy, attempted kidnapping at the very least. He handed the papers back to Emma. I will escort you to Santa Fe myself, Miss Hartley. You will have protection while you file these documents properly. Emma felt her knees weaken with relief. Thank you, Marshal, thank you. Do not thank me yet. Blackwell has money and influence. This fight is far from over. Henderson turned to his men. Break camp. We ride for Santa Fe in 15 minutes. As the marshal's men dispersed, James pulled Emma aside. You are safe now. The marshal is a good man. He will see this through. Come with me, Emma said urgently, gripping his hand. Please, James. I do not want to do this without you. I will be right beside you the whole way, he promised. I am not leaving you, Emma. Not now, not ever if you will have me. They rode into Santa Fe 5 days later, a group of 7 with Marshal Henderson at the lead and James never more than a few feet from Emma's side. The city was bustling with commerce and life, a stark contrast to the quiet wilderness they had traveled through. Emma's cousin, Margaret, lived in a modest house on the eastern edge of town, and when she opened the door to find Emma on her doorstep, she pulled her into a fierce embrace. I heard rumors that you had run, Margaret said, ushering them all inside. She was 35, a widow who had built a successful dressmaking business and had always been Emma's favorite relative. Charles sent men here asking about you, but I told them I had not seen you in years. I need your help, Margaret. I need a lawyer who cannot be bought. I know just the man. His name is Theodore Whitmore, and he hates corruption more than anything in this world. Margaret looked at Marshal Henderson. Will you testify to the legitimacy of her documents? I will do better than that. I will wire the territorial governor. If Dorsey and Blackwell have been operating this scheme, there may be other victims. The legal process was exhausting and terrifying in equal measure. Emma spent days in Theodore Whitmore's office, going over every detail of her mother's estate, every shady transaction Charles had made, every piece of evidence that proved the conspiracy. James attended every meeting, his quiet presence giving her the strength to keep going when she wanted to break down. Charles Dorsey arrived in Santa Fe a week later with Simon Blackwell and a team of lawyers, clearly expecting to intimidate Emma into compliance. Instead, he found himself facing not only Emma and her lawyer but Marshal Henderson and 2 territorial judges who had taken a personal interest in the case. The hearing took place in the courthouse, a grand building with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table with Theodore Whitmore on one side and James on the other. Across the aisle, Charles glared at her with undisguised hatred, while Simon Blackwell maintained a facade of wounded dignity. Miss Hartley, Judge Morrison began, you claim that your stepfather, Charles Dorsey, has illegally appropriated your inheritance and attempted to force you into marriage to cover his crimes. What evidence do you present? Emma stood, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I present my mother's original will, which clearly leaves all her property to me. I present the land deeds that show ownership transferred to Charles without my signature or consent. I present correspondence between Charles and Mr. Blackwell discussing payment for my hand in marriage. And I present my own testimony of the threats made against me when I refused to comply." Charles's lawyer, a slick man from Kansas City, stood immediately. "Your Honor, Miss Hartley is a confused young woman who has been unduly influenced by certain parties. She left her home in the middle of the night, stealing valuable documents, and has since been living in an immoral fashion with a common cowboy. Her testimony cannot be trusted." James started to rise, fury blazing in his eyes, but Emma's hand on his arm stopped him. She turned to face the lawyer, her chin high. "I am not confused, I am not immoral, and I am not property to be sold to the highest bidder. My mother worked for 20 years to build her estate, and she left it to me because she trusted me to protect it. I will not apologize for fighting for what is rightfully mine, and I will not be silenced by men who see women as nothing more than commodities." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Morrison had to bang his gavel for order. The hearing continued for 3 more hours, with witnesses called on both sides. Marshal Henderson testified to Emma's character and to the suspicious behavior of the men who had been hunting her. Margaret testified to the close relationship Emma had with her mother and to the changes in Charles's behavior after his wife's death. Then Theodore Whitmore played his final card. He produced a witness, a clerk from Charles's bank in Kansas City, who testified that Charles had forged Emma's signature on multiple documents and had embezzled funds from her mother's accounts. The clerk, a young man named Peter, had kept copies of the forgeries, racked with guilt over his complicity. "I knew it was wrong," Peter said, his voice shaking. "But Mr. Dorsey threatened to ruin me if I spoke. When I heard Miss Hartley was fighting back, I knew I had to come forward." Charles's facade crumbled. He lunged across the aisle toward Peter, shouting threats, and had to be physically restrained by the bailiffs. Judge Morrison called for a recess, and when court reconvened an hour later, his verdict was swift and decisive. "I find in favor of Miss Emma Hartley. All property and assets belonging to her mother's estate are to be returned to her immediately. Furthermore, I am ordering the arrest of Charles Dorsey on charges of fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Simon Blackwell, you are fined $10,000 for your role in this scheme and are hereby barred from conducting business in New Mexico territory." Emma could barely process the words through the roaring in her ears. She had won. After everything, after all the fear and running and fighting, she had won. Beside her, James squeezed her hand, and when she turned to look at him, she saw tears in his eyes that matched her own. Outside the courthouse, Margaret pulled Emma into another embrace while Marshal Henderson shook hands with Theodore Whitmore. Charles was led away in chains, still shouting about injustice, while Simon Blackwell slunk off with his lawyers in tow. Emma stood in the New Mexico sunshine, feeling as though she could finally breathe after years of suffocating. "What will you do now?" James asked quietly, standing slightly apart from the celebration. Emma turned to him, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes. He thought she would return to Kansas City now that her inheritance was secure. He thought she would resume the life she had fled, just without the threats hanging over her head. The thought of him believing she would leave him made her heart ache. "I am going to sell the Kansas property," she said, stepping closer to him. "I am going to take that money and buy land here in New Mexico, somewhere with water and good grass, somewhere I can build a home." "That sounds like a fine plan," James said, but his voice was still cautious. "James Kincaid, are you really going to make me say it plainly?" "Say what?" Emma took his hands in hers, not caring who was watching. "I want to build that home with you. I want to wake up every morning to your face. I want to learn everything there is to know about cattle and horses and this wild land you love so much. I want to spend the rest of my life with the man who saved me, not just from those men, but from a life where I was never truly free." James stared at her for a long moment, and Emma watched as hope and joy slowly replaced the uncertainty in his expression. Then he was pulling her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her in a circle, while Margaret laughed and Marshall Henderson tipped his hat with a knowing smile. "Emma Hartley," James said when he finally set her down, "will you marry me? Not because anyone is forcing you, not because of inheritance or propriety, but because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another human being." "Yes," Emma breathed. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married 3 weeks later in Margaret's parlor, with Theodore Whitmore standing as witness and Marshall Henderson giving Emma away in lieu of the father she had lost. Emma wore a dress of pale blue silk that Margaret had sewn, with wildflowers in her hair that James had picked that morning. When they exchanged vows, Emma's voice was strong and clear, free of the trembling fear that had marked her old life. "I promise to stand beside you," she said, looking into James's eyes. "To trust you with my heart and my freedom. To build a life with you where we are both wild and free, where gentleness is strength and love is the only rule that matters." James's vows were simpler but no less profound. "I promise to hold you gently, today and every day, to see you for who you truly are and to love every part of you. To be your partner, your equal, and your home, wherever that may be." When he kissed her, Emma felt the last of her walls crumble. She was no longer running, no longer afraid. She was exactly where she belonged. With the money from selling her mother's Kansas estate, Emma and James purchased 300 acres of land in the Pecos River Valley, a place of rolling grassland and clear water where cottonwoods grew thick along the riverbanks. They built their house together, a sturdy adobe structure with large windows that let in the New Mexico light and a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. James taught Emma to ride properly, and she proved to be a natural horsewoman, fearless and graceful in the saddle. Emma taught James to read and write beyond the basic skills he had learned as a boy. And together, they would spend winter evenings reading aloud from the books she had brought from Kansas City, sharing stories and dreams by lamplight. They started their herd with 50 head of cattle, purchased from a rancher near Socorro, and slowly built it through careful breeding and hard work. Emma proved to have a good head for business, keeping meticulous records and negotiating fair prices when they sold their stock. James handled the physical demands of ranching, but he always consulted Emma on decisions, treating her as the equal partner she was. Life was not without its challenges. The first winter was harsh, and they lost a dozen cattle to a blizzard that swept down from the mountains. A neighboring rancher tried to claim part of their land, leading to a tense dispute that required Marshall Henderson's intervention. Emma suffered a miscarriage in their second year of marriage, a loss that left both of them grieving for the child that might have been. But through all of it, they held each other gently. James never raised his voice to Emma, never treated her as though she were fragile or incapable. Emma never tried to change James, never asked him to be anything other than the man he was. They built their life on a foundation of mutual respect and fierce, abiding love. In the spring of their third year together, Emma discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she carried the baby to term, and on a warm October morning in 1885, she gave birth to a healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination. They named him Samuel, after Emma's father, and James held his son with the same gentle reverence he had always shown Emma. "He is perfect," James whispered, his finger stroking Samuel's tiny hand. "He is ours," Emma replied, watching her husband fall in love with their child. "The first of many, I hope." They had 2 more children in the years that followed, a daughter named Rose who inherited Emma's chestnut hair and love of books, and another son named Jack who was wild and reckless and loved the land with his father's passion. The house echoed with laughter and the chaos of family life, and Emma found herself marveling at how different her reality was from the future she had once thought inevitable. Margaret visited often, eventually relocating her dressmaking business to the nearby town of Roswell, which had sprung up along the Pecos River. She became a beloved aunt to the children, telling them stories of their mother's bravery and teaching Rose to sew. Marshall Henderson retired and bought a small place near Santa Fe, but he came by every few months to check on the family he had helped save, always welcomed with a hot meal and a warm bed. Even Theodore Whitmore became a friend, handling the legal aspects of the ranch's business and serving as godfather to young Jack. The community they built around themselves was small but strong, bound by loyalty and genuine affection rather than obligation or blood. As the years passed, Emma and James's ranch became one of the most successful in the Pecos Valley. They were known for their fair treatment of their ranch hands, paying decent wages and providing good living conditions. Several of their workers stayed for decades, becoming like extended family. Emma started a small school on the property, teaching not just her own children but the children of their employees, believing that education was the key to freedom. James never lost his love for the land, but he also never took it for granted. He taught his children to respect the earth that sustained them, to treat their animals with kindness, and to never forget that freedom was something that had to be fought for and protected. He told them the story of how he had met their mother, though he left out the more dangerous details until they were old enough to understand. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took Emma back to the canyon where he had first found her. They rode out on a perfect summer morning, leaving the children with Margaret, and spent the day revisiting the places they had traveled through during those tense days of running and hiding. "You ever regret it?" Emma asked as they sat beneath the cottonwood where James had first made camp. "Taking on my troubles, changing the course of your whole life." James looked at her, and Emma saw the same love in his eyes that she had seen on their wedding day, perhaps even deeper now, tempered by years and experience. "Emma, you did not change the course of my life. You became my life. Everything good, everything meaningful, everything worth waking up for, it all started the moment I saw you and decided to help." "I thought I was running toward freedom," Emma said softly, "but what I found was so much more than that. I found home, I found family, I found you." They made love beneath the cottonwood, under the same sky that had witnessed their first kiss, and Emma thought about how far they had come from those frightened, lonely people they had been. They had built something real and lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone, a legacy of love and gentleness in a world that so often valued hardness and control. As the years continued to unfold, Emma and James grew older together, their hair turning silver, their hands becoming weathered by work and time. Samuel took over most of the ranch operations, proving to be as skilled a cattleman as his father. Rose married a teacher from Santa Fe and opened a school in Roswell, continuing her mother's passion for education. Jack became a horse trainer, developing a reputation across the territory for his skill and patience with difficult animals. Emma and James became grandparents and then great-grandparents, watching their family tree branch and grow in ways they had never imagined. They spent their later years sitting on that porch they had built together, holding hands and watching the sunset, still finding new things to talk about, still learning new facets of each other even after decades of marriage. "You remember what you said to me that night by the fire?" Emma asked on one such evening. They were both in their 70s now, their bodies slower but their love as vibrant as ever. "About Trembling?" "I remember everything about those days," James replied. "They were the most important of my life. You changed everything for me, James. You showed me what love could be when it was freely given and gently held. You never tried to own me or control me. You just loved me." James brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "That is all love should ever be, Emma. A gift, not a cage." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars that had watched over them through all their years together. The ranch was quiet, the cattle settled for the night, and somewhere in the distance, one of their great-grandchildren was laughing. It was a sound of pure joy, unmarred by fear or constraint, and it made Emma's heart swell with gratitude. "We did good, did we not?" she said softly. "We did better than good," James replied. "We built something beautiful out of fear and desperation. We took broken pieces and made them whole. We loved each other well, Emma. That is all anyone can ask for in this life." Emma leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body beside hers. She thought about that girl who had tumbled down a ravine, terrified and alone, running from a life that sought to trap her. She thought about the cowboy who had risked his own safety to save a stranger, who had held her with such unexpected gentleness that it had unlocked her heart. "I love you, James Kincaid," she whispered. "From that first moment to this one and every moment beyond. And I love you, Emma Kincaid, my wife, my partner, my home, the bravest woman I have ever known." They stayed on the porch until the moon rose high and the night air grew cool, wrapped in each other's arms the way they had been for over 50 years. Neither of them knew how many more sunsets they would share, but they knew that whatever time they had left would be spent exactly like this, together, gentle with each other, free in the way that only true love can make a person free. When they finally went inside, James helped Emma to their room, his movements slower now but still careful, still attentive to her needs as he had always been. They climbed into the bed they had shared for decades, and Emma curled into the curve of James's body, fitting there as perfectly as she had the first time. "Thank you," she murmured, already drifting toward sleep. "For what?" James asked, his lips brushing her hair, "for holding me gently." "For seeing me, for loving me exactly as I am." James's arms tightened around her, and Emma felt the familiar warmth of his embrace, the safety she had found in his presence all those years ago and had never lost. "It was the easiest thing I ever did," he said. "Loving you was like breathing. Natural and necessary, and the only thing that kept me truly alive." Emma smiled in the darkness, her heart full to overflowing. She had started her journey running from a life that sought to diminish her, and she had ended it surrounded by love, by family, by a legacy that proved a woman's strength and a gentle man's courage. She had found freedom, not just in the legal sense, not just in owning land and making decisions, but in the truest sense of the word, the freedom to love and be loved without conditions, without fear, without restraint. As she drifted off to sleep in James's arms, Emma thought about all the young women who might one day hear their story. She hoped they would understand that real love did not demand or dominate. Real love held gently. Real love set you free to become everything you were meant to be. And real love, the kind worth fighting for, was built on respect and partnership and the willingness to see each other truly. The cowboy had said she was trembling that night by the fire, and she had whispered the truth that no one had ever held her so gently. That moment had been the beginning of everything, the crack in the wall that let the light in. The first step toward a life she had never dared to dream was possible. And now, decades later, with grandchildren sleeping in the rooms nearby and the ranch thriving under Samuel's capable hands, with Rose's school teaching dozens of children and Jack's horses known across 3 territories, with a lifetime of memories woven between them like a tapestry of shared joys and sorrows, Emma knew they had done more than survive. They had truly lived. They had built a home not just of adobe and wood, but of trust and tenderness. They had raised children who understood that strength did not require cruelty and that gentleness was not weakness. They had shown everyone who knew them what a partnership of equals looked like, what marriage could be when both people were free to be fully themselves. James Kincaid had saved Emma Hartley's life that day in the canyon, but Emma had saved his too. She had given him purpose beyond the simple rhythms of cattle and seasons. She had given him a family, a legacy, a reason to believe that the gentleness his mother had dreamed of could actually exist in this harsh world. Together, they had carved out a piece of heaven in the wild New Mexico territory, a place where love ruled instead of fear, where freedom was cherished instead of restricted, where two broken people had come together and made each other whole. And as they slept, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the roof they had built together, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, bearing witness to a love story that would echo through generations. In the morning, they would wake to another day of shared coffee on the porch, another day of watching their legacy unfold, another day of holding each other gently. But for now, in the quiet darkness, Emma and James simply rested in the peace they had fought so hard to find. Two souls who had found their perfect match in the most unlikely of circumstances, in the most perfect of ways. The end.